Okay, good morning. It's a pleasure to be here with you. Thank you all for your presence. I'm especially honored to be here today, and I'd like to thank the Institute of Economics of Unicamp for the invitation. So thank you, Professor Bruno, Célio, Professor Carol. It's really an honor to be here in this important School of Economic Thought in Brazil and in Latin America. So my name is Camila Gramkow, as mentioned. I work at the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, ECLAC in English, or CEPAL in our dearest Portuguese and Spanish languages. And I would like this to be more of a relaxed conversation and a dialogue. So we'll be using some PowerPoint slides to support our conversation, but please feel free to ask questions or make comments throughout the interventions. So the idea is to present to you an approach that we have been developing at ECLAC, named the Big Push for Sustainability, El Gran Impulso para la Sostenibilidad. So in very simple terms, as we have in Europe the Green New Deal, or in the United States, the Build Back Better framework. At ECLAC, we proposed the Big Push for Sustainability approach for Latin American and Caribbean countries. So this talk will be divided in 4 main sessions, and this is the way in which we approach, in which we analyze the proposal of the Big Push for Sustainability. I have to say that I'm very happy to see Professor Medeiros here. He was my professor in economic development theories. I'm very honored to be sitting here in front of you, Professor. And a lot of what you will see today is inspired by your own classes. So the 4 sessions that this presentation was organized in are the analytical frameworks of the Big Push for Sustainability. So the first one is an assessment of the unsustainabilities of the current development patterns or styles, as we say in ECLAC. So we analyze the social, economic, and environmental dimensions of the existing development styles. Then we have a second session, which is to analyze the impacts of the pandemics and the major global shifts that have been occurring in the region and how these then impact on the structural characteristics of the development styles. The third one is the proposal part. It concerns what is the big push in terms of policy proposals. What is it that we are actually proposing for a more productive, inclusive, and sustainable future in the countries of the region. And then in the last bit, we will decide together, based on your interests, a more practical application of the Big Push for Sustainability. So let's start with the unsustainabilities of the old normalities. ECLAC has been a long-standing school of economic thought and analysis. And one of the things that ECLAC has been drawing attention to is the recessionary bias. This idea regards or concerns the fact that there are global imbalances in trade. And what happens is that the countries that have surpluses, such as Netherlands and others, they have no incentive to change, to shift their policies. And so the adjustment of these imbalances fall on the peripheral economies. And this creates a recessionary reinforcement bias that drives the global economic activity downwards. Hence, it's a recessionary bias. This idea has been first formulated by Keynes, and it has become even more stark, even stronger in the recent periods. In this graph here, you can see that in the light blue, the global trade has always been, or has been for most of the period of trade liberalization, a driver of GDP growth. The rate of growth of trade has been larger historically in this period than the GDP. This means that trade has been driving economic growth. But this has changed dramatically since the Great Recession of 2008, 2009. The GDP is the dark blue line, and there you can see that both trade and GDP have been growing at the same pace. This means that the recessionary bias has been working at its full potential in the recent years, and that trade has no longer been able to become a driving force of global economic growth. So the dynamics of GDP has changed. GDP is growing less, and it's not being driven anymore by growth, by trade. In Latin America and the Caribbean, if we take a look at the long term, so looking at average growth rates of GDP from 1960 to 2019, the year prior to the pandemic, we can see that Latin America and the Caribbean has been lagging behind most of the world regions, with the exception of the least developed countries in Sub-Saharan Africa and in Europe and Central Asia. So in the long term, the region is still remaining as a peripheral economic region in the world. Socially, looking at the social pillar, we can see this graph is very interesting because it shows the income growth rate per adult by income percentile. In the period of, no, it's not in the graph there, but it's around in the first decade of the 2000s. And what we can see there is that all income percentiles have grown. So everyone, all social classes have experienced a growth in their income. However, the distribution of the curve is very unequal. There has been some larger gross income in the first percentiles. Then you can see the income of the middle class, which is lower than all the other percentiles. And in the orange shaded area there, you can see that most of the increase, it's almost an exponential line, has occurred in the 0.001%. So this means that the richer have become a lot more richer than they already were in the past. And this shows, of course, that there has been increasing social disparities worldwide. In Latin America and the Caribbean, even though there have been important improvements, if we compare the 1980s to the 2000s, there have been important improvements in income distribution in Latin America and the Caribbean, but the region has not been able to overcome the characteristic of being the top one, the number one most unequal region in the world. So the structural characteristic remains. In terms of the environment, and here it's important to state that we are selecting some highlights, indicators. These are in any way a full assessment of all these three pillars, economic, social, and environmental. But these are just indicators to show that the existing development styles are not sustainable by any lenses that we want to look at, neither economically, socially, or environmentally. And in terms of the environment, perhaps one of the most important indicators is the loss of natural capital, deforestation. This is by far the largest driver of greenhouse gas emissions in the region, and it is by far the strongest force of ecosystem imbalances. And by that, I mean deforestation is predominantly responsible for regulating water cycles, for the provision of fertility that is important to land, and other important ecosystem services. So the region has been experiencing in the past 15 years a loss of over 100 million hectares of natural capital, and of course this is an unsustainable trend in environmental terms. The context prior to the pandemic has not been very different in Brazil, the country in which we are right now. So the 5-year period prior to the pandemic had an annual growth rate of minus 0.4%. So Brazil was very fragile economically prior to the pandemic. The social situation had been deteriorating prior to the pandemic. This is very important because some of us are inclined to think that these trends have been imposed by the pandemic, but these have been structural characteristics of the Latin American economies that have become even more evident when the pandemic was installed. And of course, in terms of the environment, Brazil presented higher than global world average increase in greenhouse gas emissions. So when the COVID-19 pandemic hit the region, the economies of the region, it hit the region in a context of structural development gaps. And what this has meant is that the pandemic widened or deepened the development gaps. When we look at Brazil, this is an interesting historical series with all its flaws and uncertainties. But if we look in history, the drop in GDP in the first year of the pandemic is really comparable to major hits in the global economy since the beginning of the 19th century. So this is comparable, or it was even a starker drop in economic activity than the First World Wars, than the crisis of the 1930s, and it's comparable to recent crises. In social terms, NACLA estimates that more than 20 million people have entered into poverty. So this is additional people entering into poverty than the ones that already were in poverty in the region. And as you know, it's a significant share of the population. So in the graph, you can see that 30% of the population was already in poverty prior to the pandemic, and this has been increased to nearly 40% of the population. Of course, the increase in poverty would have been larger in the absence of cash transfers. That this was a very important social policy to avoid an even starker increase in poverty. In the environment pillar, on the other hand, we might all recall that we saw temporary relief. There were no cars circulating on the streets, so we could see the clear air. I don't know how many of you live in São Paulo, but if you are there, if you catch an airport plane back home there, you will see that there is this black smoke that stays over the atmosphere of São Paulo. This has completely been, or almost completely been eliminated during the pandemic because there were no cars, there was no buses circulating, the industry had reduced its activities, and for all these reasons, there was a temporary relief on the environmental pillar. But what I want to highlight is this study by Nature Climate Change that estimated the impacts of the social isolation measures on greenhouse gas emissions. And of course, we can see that there is a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, and in the bottom graph, we can see an example here for Brazil. This is very intuitive. As I was saying, most of the emissions that have been avoided in social isolation periods was due to reduced usage of surface transport. And the main conclusion of this study is that once these measures were lifted, the emissions got back immediately to the standard they were before. And even worse, as now we can see in the more recent period, and this has also to do with the Russia-Ukraine conflict, the emission levels are much higher than the pre-pandemic levels. The use of fossil fuels have been much higher than pre-pandemic levels. And what does this tell us? It's not about degrowth. It's not about reducing the scale. We need to talk about structural change. If we are serious about sustaining emission reductions in the long term, we need to talk about how we produce, distribute, and consume energy, how we move around people and merchandise in the territory. This is the kind of conversation that we need to talk about if we are serious about sustaining emission reductions in the long term. Now, bringing a bit of I cannot help quoting Raul Prebisch, which is one of the founders and fathers of NACLA's economic thinking. He wrote a text in the year 1980, so a text that is older than most of you for sure. He wrote a text about the environmental crisis and linking the environmental crisis to his original seminal ideas of structuralism economic thinking. And what he said, and this is still the root of our current thinking at NACLA, is that the environmental crisis will not bring new problems, it will aggravate the structural development problems that the region already faces. And let me illustrate his points with two examples. The first of one is social inequalities. The environmental crisis, and it's important to state that in the year 1980, Raul Prebisch didn't have any of the evidence that we currently have, any of the scenarios on the effects of climate change, on the effects of biodiversity loss, of water desertification, and many other environmental problems. So even in the absence of this information, he was able to build these bridges between the environmental crisis and the economic structural gaps. So in terms of social inequality, when we think about the environmental effects, the extreme weather impacts, we are talking about droughts. Droughts will be the most important impact in the case of Brazil. There will be longer and more intense periods of droughts in this country. And this will happen simultaneously with extreme water events. We are seeing hurricanes and cyclones in the southern part of Brazil. We are also seeing floods and extreme rains. These are not contradictory events. These are extreme weather events that will keep occurring more intensely and with more frequency. And the people that are more impacted by these events are the poor, because they don't have the economic conditions to move, as they tend to live in vulnerable areas, so in areas subject to floods, in areas subject to landslides, deslizamentos, favelas, for example. So they're not able to move, they cannot cope with the event. This is one example. And the second one, and it's really connected to a core aspect that ECLAC and many of you have been studying, is it will aggravate external vulnerabilities. In the recent period, Brazil and other South American economies have reprimarized their export baskets. So they have become more dependent on natural resources on their export baskets. And guess what? What are the agricultural crops that will suffer the most damage from climate? Soybeans, coffee, rice, all of the major components in our export baskets, in addition to the economic vulnerabilities that you are already very familiar with, now they will also be, or already being, subject to climate vulnerabilities. So, to put this into perspective, and this is also an axis or part of the analysis. So when we look at what the current development styles look like, we also need to look not only how they look like looking backwards, looking at the past, but looking to the future. This is very common in climate economics, and I think that perhaps we should be doing more this in economics in general. So this is essentially looking at business as usual, or the no action scenarios. If we do nothing about the climate, about income distribution, about the patterns of trade insertion in global value chains, if we do nothing about it, if we keep things as they are, what will happen with our economies? So in the context of the climate crisis itself, uncontained global warming, so no action if we do nothing, will lead to a drop from 10 to 20% of GDP per year. Let's put this in perspective. In Brazil, the effect of The COVID pandemic in the year 2020 was 3.7, 3.7 versus 10-20% per year. These estimates, the 10 to 20% estimates, come from the Stern report, which is still the major landmark in climate change economics. It's still the most important influential report. It's from the year 2007. And he said in the 10-year anniversary of the report, and I had the honor or privilege to be able to be at the event, he said that he was too conservative, that his estimates did not take into account the most extreme events at the bottom of the tails of the distribution. So the difference between climate impact, climate economic impacts, and the COVID is that we know beforehand it's coming. We know it's going to be tough. We know it's going to hit hard our economies, and we know what to do in order to avoid it. So I'm sorry that up to this point, these are very bad news. The development pillars of Latin American and Caribbean countries are very fragile, socially, economic, environmentally, and the future does not look good if we don't do anything to tackle these problems. I'm sorry. Some people may say this is eco-terrorism, but it's science. It's science, it's not witchcraft. And we have to talk about it. We need to bring these issues into light. So let's try and shift the debate a little bit into the good news. And what we have recently seen worldwide is that there have been increasingly or a more intense use of green recovery policies and packages. So let's give a deeper look into that. First thing that it's important to say on these policies and packages is that they started with the Great Recession of 2008-2009. This Great Recession came shortly after the Stern report, which I just mentioned. So international attention was being drawn to this theme. The Nobel Prize was given to the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change. The IPCC is the technical body that reviews the state of the art, what we know about climate, physical science. So Nobel Prize went to the IPCC. It was important, it was making important progress, not just on climate change, but also on ecosystem services, the importance of the loss of biodiversity in ecosystem services. It was in this context that the Great Recession erupted, and it was then that the first proposals and concepts to tackle multiple crises simultaneously came up for the first time. So we had Rio Plus 20 over here in Rio de Janeiro in 2012, which has as one of its key topics the concept of the green economy. The World Bank came up with the proposal of the green growth. Other stakeholders came up with the low carbon recovery. And it was then in 2008 that the first ever proposal for a global Green New Deal came up. Of course, back then, some of these proposals translated into policies. Over 500 billion have been allocated to green fiscal stimulus. Most of them came from G20 countries. These represented 0.7% of the global GDP, and of course it was below the target, the 1% target of the then Global Green New Deal. And one of the reasons why it didn't become mainstream, it was kind of more a marginal approach. One or another country adopted these measures, some to more extent than others, is that, and this perhaps is the most important lessons learned from the previous crisis, there was a focus on monetary measures. The main economic instrument that was used to try and combat the effects of that crisis was quantitative easing. Of course, it led to the result that we all know and we are familiar with. Currently, COVID-19 pandemic, new context, new policies being adopted, I will not go into all of details. This presentation will be available to you later. But we can see proposals appearing in all of the regions of the world, both developed and developing. I will not go into more details now because I will show some more examples, but the important thing here is that diverse countries are presenting diverse strategies that have both the idea of fiscal spending with green or sustainable criteria incorporated on them. The most important thing about these movements that started in the Great Recession of 2008, 2009 is that it represented a paradigmatic change. Instead of countries and policymakers and academics even asking if climate change is real, is it really happening? They started asking themselves, what is the best course of action? And for the first time ever, climate policy was presented within the framework of driving economic recovery, of driving economic growth. So this, in practice, represented disruptive movement from the discourse or from the narrative that environmental and climate policies in particular are always an obstacle to economic growth, are always an obstacle to development. Currently, we have seen that the relevance of the climate debate is more important than ever. To use the terminology that the Secretary General of the United Nations mentioned last week, he said that we are living in an era of global boiling. And he was referring to the recent records in temperatures that we are seeing in Europe, in the United States, in Canada. You must all be following the news with all the fires that are happening there. But if we bring this discussion to Brazil, we are also observing heat records. We saw recently the biggest droughts in decades in the Pantanal. You might recall the images. I decided not to include it because they are very disturbing. Historic, floods in Acre, in Bahia, bomb cyclones and tornadoes. We are seeing this with the ever-increasing frequency in Santa Catarina and Rio Grande do Sul. So why are we not talking about the climate crisis anymore? And some countries have even adopted a formal institutional state of climate emergency, because it's not a problem of the future. It's already happening. It's already in place with very important impacts. Yes, let's move on. So remember those 500 billion of the previous crisis? This number has increased almost tenfold in the current crisis, in the COVID-19 pandemic. Fiscal stimulus. The green fiscal stimulus reached 1.8 trillion. This is an estimate, and I want you to remember this number, 1.8 trillion by June 2021. From 2021 to nowadays, a lot have changed, and you'll see this shortly. But back then, you'll see this greenness of stimulus indexes developed by a UK consultancy named Vivid Economics, and the latest estimates they made is for this period. And what this graph tells us is that up to June 2021, in most of the countries, the red bars, which represent a negative impact of the stimulus on the environment, were larger than the positive bars. So the net impact of the green packages, of the stimulus packages of the countries, the net impact was negative on the environment for most of the countries by then. But we can see that some of them started early on responding in a more positive way or in a more coherent way with their own environmental objectives. Part of the reason why we see this configuration back then is that these stimulus were more like an urgent response. The countries had to do something in order to avoid total collapse. But when they started doing planning and when the long-term perspective comes back into the scene, the composition changes dramatically. And I would like to bring to your attention two examples, the examples of the Build Back framework in the United States and the example of the New Deal in Europe. The Build Back Better framework is the greatest directing of public resources to the sustainable agenda ever carried out in the US. And I want to draw your attention to the numbers. Remember that until 2021, we had 1.8 trillion worldwide in green fiscal stimulus. Now, looking at the US alone, has launched the Infrastructure Investments and Job Acts. And I want you to pay attention to the names as well, because they're not intuitive. And the latest one, the Inflation Reduction Act, both of them accounting for over 1.5 trillion US dollars in the US alone for green stimulus. And the reason why I wanted to draw your attention to the names is that the green part of it, the sustainable, the sectors in which these stimulus are focused on are a mere detail. The focus of these policies are to create millions of quality jobs, to enable Americans to enter and stay in the workforce, to drive long-term economic growth, reduce inflationary pressures. You cannot see the environmental goals here. And in my opinion, this is a very positive shift or a positive application of the big push for sustainability, or the idea that the green economic sectors, the green technologies, green areas and practices and initiatives can be used if the right mix of policies is designed as an incentive, as a leverage, as a big push for both sustainability, environmental sustainability and socioeconomic development. So we have some, I have been including the sources, so the topics that you are interested in, you can see more materials, and I'm also happy to provide any more additional details, but this presentation is kind of a mix of many different materials that we have been developing at NACLA. So, Build Back Better framework, even the name, Build Back Better, let's come out stronger and better from this tragedy and dramatic crisis that the COVID pandemic represented. Let's bring jobs back to America, from China to America. These are explicit policy objectives in the Build Back Better framework. And one more thing I want to highlight about the Build Back Better framework is that it is state-led. The role of the state is back. The state is the coordinator, it is the orchestra of these policies. It is the one that brings coordination, a sense of direction, short, medium, and long-term targets, and missions, the sense of missions to the actors. And just to illustrate this point, one important component of the Build Back Better framework is that the state puts itself as an example. So this means that the entirety of the transport fleet of the US government will be electric, for instance. There will be retrofitting of the buildings to foster energy efficiency, among a lot of other measures that the state of the US will do. Now imagine the scale of the demand that the US government is generating for its own industries and for the development of the green techs and industries in the US territory. In the European Union, the New Deal is an older in the sense that it's not post-pandemic. It was developed in the Great Recession of 2008-2009. and it has many similarities to the US Build Back Better framework. But the objectives here are more environmental. So you can see that the first objective is no net emission. So the EU has decided to become emissions neutral by 2050. Economic growth decoupled from resource use. Try and decouple value-added income, jobs from resource use. And the idea of leaving no one behind or improving distribution. And again, let me draw your attention to the numbers. Remember, 2021, 1.8 trillion. Now, the European Union alone, 1 trillion euros only for the investment plan. And then with the pandemic, an additional input of resources named the Next Generation Review with further 800 million euros. So these are all trends, or these are all measures that are being announced and are being put in practice. And again, in the case of the European Union, the role of the state is very clear in driving and helping, supporting, and guiding the transformation of their countries. So we are talking about the major economic blocks in our modern days going into that direction. What does that represent and what does that tell us for Latin America and the Caribbean countries? There would be many other examples that I could share. China, of course, is a major player, and I hope I'll have time to share more details about it. But the important thing here is the world, or the advanced economies, have chosen the direction they're moving towards. And if we do not embark on these trends, it will be another reason or another factor of lagging behind the world market. So this brings us finally to the big push for sustainability, which, as I mentioned in the beginning, is the proposal or the approach that CEPAL is developing for Latin American and Caribbean countries to build a more productive, inclusive, and sustainable future. Going back to what I was saying before, so we have seen the three main analytical parts of the big push. We have seen that first we analyze the unsustainability of the current development routes. We have seen some of these indicators before. Then we have a part that analyzes the impacts of inaction and climate inaction in particular, but other types of inaction and how these tend to aggravate or reproduce development gaps. We saw some figures about this. And now I would like to go into more details about the proposal. And the proposal of the big push is centered on investments. Why investments? Because investments can drive economic activity, can drive income and job creation in the short run, and because investments are the main link between the short and the long run. It is investments of today that explain tomorrow's productive structure. No surprise, we can really tell what's going to happen in the future based on the patterns of the current investments. So the origin, and I have Professor Carlos Medeiros here, we could give an entire class about the big push to all of you, and I will take a lot of liberties here, Professor, because we are applying the big push in a very specific way in CEPAL. So the big push for sustainability, and I really encourage all of you to take Professor Medeiros' classes. It's really fantastic. It's mind-blowing. We tend to look a lot at the mainstream theories, micro and macro, but we have all these amazing development theories that, at least for me, have inspired my career as an economist significantly. So the big push is a development. It's a classic development theory. It was developed by Paul Rosenstein-Rodin in the 50s and the 60s. And this paragraph resumes or summarizes the main two ideas of this classic theory that we import or that we adjust from this classic theory into the present and into thinking about the future of Latin American and Caribbean countries. So he said that, Paul Rosenstein-Rodin said that in order for development to occur, it's like an airplane lifting from the ground. An airplane only lifts from the ground if there is a minimum speed. And likewise, development will only occur if there is a minimum scale of investments. If there is not a minimum scale of investments, development will not occur. This is number one, scale. Second one is coordination. Just like an airplane needs to have a specific structure, shape, materials, weight, etc., and so forth, the types of the investments need to be carefully crafted in order for development to occur. So the first point, scale, is an implicit criticism to the marginal approach, to the bit-by-bit approach. We are talking about structural change. It's a big push, it's structural. We are talking about a profound change in our lifestyles, in our productive structures, in our ways of consumption. And the second one is about coordination. When we think about the green transition, low carbon transition, we all hear a lot of these terms. There really needs to be coordination. And let me illustrate this point with a very simple example. And I think that this is one of the beauties of the big push theories that was later also shown by game theory. One investment will only become profitable if another investment in another area is happening simultaneously. So let me illustrate that. The investments made in electric vehicles will only be profitable if simultaneously investments are being made in the recharging infrastructure. It's very obvious, but it's not that obvious when we look at some policies that have been designed. So the combination of the investments matter and the scale of these investments matter. These are the 2 points that we extract or inspire ourselves from the original big push theory. Then we have developed at NACLA what we call the threefold efficiency. The first one is the Schumpeterian efficiency, which in simple terms has to do with the efficiency of the productive structure, how intensive in knowledge, in learning that economy is. And this is quite intuitive to understand. If there are more knowledge-intensive sectors in the economy and it is more integrated, this knowledge, this learning is flowing, and this is creating positive externalities, spillover effects and other types of positive reinforcing effects that creates positive externalities throughout the economy. This is the Schumpeterian efficiency. We also analyze the Keynesian efficiency, looking more into the demand. And in essence, what we look is that the Tirol condition, which says that there are positive externalities of being capable to compete or to insert an economy in the fastest growing markets. Now, one is very closely related to the other because the fastest growing markets globally tend to also be the most technology intensive markets. I'm looking at the time because I could really, you have to control me because otherwise I'll keep talking a lot. I will not give an example because I want to talk a bit more about the practical evidence. So we have supply, we have demand, and we also, of course, need to have the sustainability efficiency, which concerns economic viability, social justice, and environmental sustainability. If we had to pick one slide to describe the big push for sustainability, this would be it, and I'll try to be succinct. And what is my main intention with this conversation here today is to provoke you to think, to incorporate the environmental dimension, and to develop your own analyses, your own proposals. And this is very important because we, and here I mean we as academics now, wearing the academic hat, we need to move in pace with the policy. The policy is already there, they're already being implemented. So we need to be able to provide evidence and substance to our policymakers here. And I have to say that there has been a tremendous shift in the case of Brazil in this direction. The federal government of Brazil is working on the ecological transition plan, on the green neo-industrialization strategy, on the new Green Pact, the program of acceleration of growth, on the bioeconomy strategy. So the moment for producing this technically based, evidence-based proposal is now. So I really strongly encourage you to help and to create this positive environment of discussion and building of proposals. So the big push for sustainability approach. It has four main steps, another disclaimer here, it's important to recall that CEPAL is a United Nations organism. So most of the research that we do nowadays, they need to have practical applications. So you will see that this might look simple at times, and this is on purpose because the stakeholders with whom we have dialogues, policymakers, industrial leaders, they need to be able to understand what it is that we are proposing. So the big push for sustainability approach, it has four main steps. It is an approach to change development style. So the first question is, what is this new development style that we want to build? What are the aspirations of the country with regards to these new development styles? And of course, this question needs to be answered on a case-by-case basis. There is no one-size-fits-all ideal development style for all of the countries, but we do not leave that question completely unanswered. We provide some pillars, some lights to help the discussion. And the first one is the national aspirations. What objectives, goals are already defined in development plans, sectoral plans, strategies, and so forth. Vocations, what are the characteristics of the labor force, of the natural resources in the country, the mechanisms to respond to global challenges, the climate challenge, for instance, is a global challenge by nature. It is no use that Brazil reduces its emissions if another country is not reducing them. We are talking about a single atmosphere. So it's a global challenge in its very nature. So what are the mechanisms that will be in place for this global coordination to occur? There are some examples on the screen. And of course, the threefold efficiency that I was just mentioning. We need to think about the set of policies and investments that deliver the threefold efficiency. So these are the pillars that indicate the direction of the change that we want to achieve. The second is coordination. Remember, the big push, one of the two elements that we captured from the classic theory of the big push is coordination. And here we are talking about broad coordination between public stakeholders, private stakeholders, community, non-government, academic, national, subnational. It is important to have a coherence in the policy instruments and mechanisms so that we can achieve scale, the second element of the big push. The scale of the transformation is dramatic. The estimates vary, but it is comparable to the scale of the change that happened in the Asian countries. So we are talking about at least 20% of GDP of investments in order to drive this change. This is a very, very dramatic change. Bear in mind that the investment levels currently in Brazil, the investment rate in Brazil is around 15 or 30%, if I'm not mistaken. So it's almost doubling the investment efforts and directing all of these new investments to the right sectors, to the right areas. So we have the direction, we have coordination, and with the coordination, we will be able to mobilize the necessary funds, and then we have the impacts. Before going to impacts, one thing I want to say about the investments is that when we look at the combination, at the mix, and perhaps this is the uniqueness of the big push for sustainability compared to other models and approaches with similar goals, combating the climate crisis and promoting economic recovery. So the uniqueness of the big push is that we depart from a point of view of a developing country. And because of that, because we are very aware of the development gaps, when we talk about the combination of investments, we are not only talking about green areas per se. So we're not just talking about electrifying the fleet, investing in recharging infrastructure, in recycling, in waste management, in renewable energy, in the circular economy, in the it's not only that, of course it's that. The environment criteria needs to be there, but it's much more than that. And I want to emphasize this very strongly and very clearly. The only way the low carbon transition agenda can become a development agenda is if there are also investments in developing national capabilities. To put this very simply, if we are not able to translate this into this green transition into job creation, into having industries that are capable of producing these new goods and services and materials, we will import them necessarily. This is already happening. So I cannot emphasize this enough because this is very CEPAL, the endogenization of technical progress, if you want to go back to Celso Furtado and Raul Prebisch. This is still key. China alone is responsible for 80% of the world's green patents. Technology is not being produced here, it's being produced elsewhere. The debate of finance of developed countries, providing finance to developing countries is fundamental. It needs to happen, but we need to talk about technological transfer as well. If there is no industrial policy, productive development policy, innovation policy, closely linked, closely attached to the low carbon transition agenda, it will be a low carbon transition agenda based on imports, and it will be a missed opportunity in terms of development. Brazil starts from a very strong point in this sense compared to many other Latin American and Caribbean countries. Brazil already has a significant industrial park. It already has competitive green niches. Biofuels, for instance, Brazil is a major world player in the biofuels market, but it could be so much more. And this brings so much more from CEPAL's debates. I don't want to extend myself much more here, but this then brings the discussion of regional integration. There is so much potential for development and for achieving an effective, sustainable development path if we bring back to the table the discussion of regional integration. Brazil, Argentina, Colombia, Mexico, they could be major suppliers of these new green goods, technologies, and so on to the region. We can also think about an integrated infrastructure of renewable energy, an integrated infrastructure of low carbon sustainable logistics. There's so much that can be done at the regional level, and This is one thing I wanted to emphasize about the mix. So from the CEPAL's perspective, the development of national capabilities or developing within the territory, the capabilities to produce, to generate the jobs in the industry. The jobs in the industry are still the higher paid, are still the decent jobs, the carteira assinada, the formal jobs. They are still these sectors, and even though services are fundamental, the core creators of high income positions are still in the industry and high value added sectors. And of course, disclaimer here again, there are high tech sectors in agriculture, as the other industry, there are high tech sectors in services as well. And here we are really talking about the knowledge intensity. So if we are able to coordinate and build this mix of policies, this will lead to the complementary investments that we aspire, not just the low carbon investments themselves, but the productive investments, the education and human investments as well. And this will, of course, create you a new investment-led economic growth cycle, income generation. It will cut down emissions. It might even restore natural capital when we think about investments in recovering degraded land, in reforestation, among others. So it is really a shift towards the desired development style. I have a few minutes left, so I really want to bring your attention to the strategic areas. We have been working very hard over the last year in CEPAL to understand not only the policy mix, but the mix of areas or missions, which is the kind of word of the moment for the big push. So what are the areas that the policies and the investments should focus on? And we have been working hard to identify the areas that can deliver positive impacts on the three dimensions, positive economic, social, and environmental dimensions. And currently, the list is now at 13. You can see these areas on the screen. We started with 7, 8, 9, and now we have 13 areas that have the potential to transform the future towards a more inclusive, productive, and sustainable future. And I want to finalize by perhaps emphasizing the point I was making earlier about the importance of national capabilities. CEPAL has a partnership with the CNI, which is the Brazilian Confederation for National Industry. This report will be made available in English soon. Which is a partnership to help the Brazilian industry, the manufacturing sector, come up with recommendations on what a strategy for eco or green innovation should look like in the case of Brazil. This means that the industrial sector is willing to fight for this. This represents, again, a paradigmatic change. And because in the beginning I only emphasized the bad news, the pessimistic, I will emphasize at this last part of the talk, the positive and reasons for hope, maybe. So we have an important stakeholder, Brazil CNI, perhaps the greatest confederation of industry in Latin America and the Caribbean, will present a manifest to the Brazilian government saying what policies they want, because they want to do more eco-innovation, become competitive, become a protagonist in the global market in these areas. So we have developed some indicators to start understanding what is happening with eco-innovation or green innovation worldwide. And first thing we always hear there is a global green race. We wanted to check if that was true. Is it really? Indeed it is. Green patents grew more than 20% in the last decades. This is more than 10 times any other patent. So it is a stronger technological rate or a faster technological rate than any other. China is taking the lead. Let me see if I have the graph. I hope I have the graph in the number one. China is taking the lead, but as I mentioned before, China alone is currently responsible for 80% of world's green patents. It's also the world's industrial park. The role that Brazil has been having on this green technological race, the first one is that when we look at the share of the green in the total patents, we can see that there is a growing movement. Of course, if the growth in green patents is faster than total, of course, the share needs to be showing this increase, and it's true for Brazil as well. But when we look only at the green, let's look only at the green. What's happening with Brazil's share? Brazil is lagging behind. We started with a strong position, but Brazil has been lagging behind. And the reason that Brazil has been lagging behind, this has also been happening with other countries. We cannot see the as legendas, né? Subtract? No, I forgot the name. You cannot see this correctly, but the yellow line represents China, and you can see a very aggressive strategy from China in dominating the global green patent markets. And this has led to a drop not just in Brazil, which is very slow, very small compared to other countries, but also in Europe, the United States, and other major players. There has been an increasing number of eco-innovations. There are currently nearly 200 public policy measures explicitly and directly targeted to support climate RD&D. Green industrial policy instruments are back, and you can see here that the number has been increasing, and these are green industrial policy instruments that have explicit objectives to induce or to promote industrial development in green sectors. I will not present the three-gap model because of the time, but this is another analytical framework developed by my esteemed colleague, Gabriel Porcilli. But I would like to focus or to present very briefly some of the scenario simulations. The green gap model, just to say a word or two about it, is a very powerful analytical frameworks that quantifies three growth rates. So the economic growth rate necessary for a competitive external insertion, the growth rate necessary to overcome policy, and the growth rate that is compatible with global warming. So it's these three rates. It's a very simple model. And then what structural transformations need to happen in order for there to be convergence. So that's, we can find a single growth rate that delivers the three objectives. Now going to the policy scenarios, and we'll end with this. This is one of the things we do in CEPAL. We test our ideas with models that provide some evidence of whether our hypotheses and ideas make sense, but we also test them in practice via cooperation projects with countries in this area. So I will be showing you very briefly some of the scenario simulations we carried out for the big push for sustainability. So here we simulated a reference scenario. It's showing a different one for me. Okay, sorry about that. We simulate a reference scenario that represents business as usual. What happens in the future of Latin American and Caribbean countries if we do nothing about nothing? If we keep doing things as it always has been. So it reproduces historical social and economic gaps. And then we have the big push for sustainability scenario, which simulates the investments in the key areas. This is a simulation in the year 2022. So these are the areas. I will not go into details. You can see later on our modeling strategy. But what is important here is that this scenario simulates a mix of investments in policies in sustainable energy transition, sustainable mobility, bioeconomy, digital transformation, health, manufacturing industry, the circular economy, and the care economy. These are the sectors that are targeted by policies and investments in this scenario. And what our results show is that there is an acceleration of GDP growth, and these results are always in comparison to the reference scenario. So this is in comparison to doing nothing, what could happen if we did policies focused on those strategic areas. So there's positive GDP effects up to or slightly higher than 5% by 2030. Most of the growth in GDP is led by investments by design, because these policies are designed to induce investments, over 8%. Consumption increases as an indirect effect of income and employment generation. And of course, there is increase also in global spending, again, by design because of the mix of policies and areas. And these results are obtained with greenhouse gas reductions. And a greenhouse gas reduction of 35%, which is more than the current climate commitments of Latin American and Caribbean countries. This also leads, this is one example, to other local atmospheric contaminants. So the message that I want to close with and open to questions and for the debate is that we can think and we can design and we can come up with the right mix of policies and investments that can indeed deliver positive results in the three dimensions, in the economic, social, and environmental dimension. Of course, the challenge is much larger than the development challenge was for the region 30, 40, 60 years ago. It is larger, but the results do compensate. The results are very positive and very robust. So I wanted to end with this provocation and with some evidence, some figures, and happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Camila, for your insightful presentation. And let's open the floor for questions then collects. Mariana. And you can introduce yourselves.
Okay, I am Mariana. I have just finished my PhD here at Unicamp. I also work with this thematic, especially with energy transition and green finance. So my question is related to it. I would like to know if you have discussed it in this big rush for sustainability package, some financial instruments, or I don't know, tax reforms that are being discussed now by the government to finance especially these state-led policies that you are proposing. So it's more a curiosity because I think this is a hot topic and I mentioned if you want to.
Yeah. So,
thank you very much. Thank you, your excellent presentation. Really. Well, big problem that we are living today is that if you think that capitalist society normally choose a market price just for these problems, like carbon price. So you are proposing a kind of coordination activities in this big push. That is an activity that has to be led by the state, so that we are discussing the possibilities for a kind of state-led green growth.
Mm-hmm.
And the problem is very political because how to induce the private sector to do things without giving fantastic subsidies for these movements and all that. So I think that, well, this is the problem, but I'd like to hear something from
Hi, Manuel Gonzalo from Universidad Nacional de Quilmes and the city. Thank you very much for your presentation, Camila. I have one punctual question related, for example, to these transition sources or fuels, such as, for example, gas. Because you know that in Argentina we have like large reserves of gas, and in some sense, gas could contribute for to move our external restrictions, export gas, for example, to China or to India, and also contribute India, in the case of China, to reduce their carbon use. So how are you seeing these type of fuels? Also, I don't know if you could say some words on nuclear. And my second question is related perhaps with these issues, because of course that the green agenda is really strong. In SACE there were a lot of presentations on this issue, and of course that is really good. But sometimes, for example, when I listen to the European approaches to this problem and our role in this context, it seems that, well, we will buy technology from the European Union, they will give finance for us, and we will only put, I mean, the Amazonas or lithium. And don't you think that this type of approach is mainly from the European Union? Give us little space in order to develop technology, capabilities.
I think maybe Camila can answer, and then we make another round.
So thank you for the very interesting questions. Mariana, good to see you again after a long time. And I also follow your research. Pleasure to see you. So yes, we have recently launched a report at the BNDES, the National Development Bank of Brazil, on the financing bit, how to finance the big push. So there is a proposal about that. And the main point of the proposal is that there should be governance of these funds. There are funding sources that are available. It is also possible to find other sources. BNDES has done some green bonds, has issued some green bonds, for instance. But the main thing is to have a coordination, and we have a proposal of 6 different funds, how to finance each, what financing mechanisms each area should have. So I'm happy to share that material with you. And you asked specifically about tax and fiscal, and also linking to Professor Medeiros' question later on. We have worked closely with the Environment Commission of the Federal Senate in Brazil to support them into developing a green tax reform proposal in Brazil. And so this is written, the report is there, I'm happy to share. But I have to say that has been little political space for this debate to enter. The tax reform that is being under consideration by the National Congress mentions the selective taxes, distributos seletivos, né? And the environment can be one of the criteria, but it essentially leaves for the future what kind of criteria and what this will look like. So it can still be a green tax reform, but it's a debate that's not happening now. This criteria, the instruments, how they're going to be used, is a discussion that will happen in the future. And in my personal understanding, I think that the strategy was to approve as soon as possible the new tax framework and leave the more complicated, politically sensitive debate for later. Hopefully, it will happen later. And linking to your point, Professor, this is vital. You went to the heart of it. And I will answer these questions mostly from a personal perspective and not from CEPAL. The big push, in my view, is a confrontation to the mainstream proposals that are based on market pricing mechanisms, be it carbon markets, be it carbon taxing. So what they say, you are all economists, you all know, is that there is an externality, you need to put a price on it, you put a price on it, and everything will be corrected. This is not true, not just theoretically, as you know very well, but in practice. No country that has adopted, I'm not against market pricing instruments, but the evidence is so clear that them being individually implemented will not be effective in driving the change that we want. They're socially regressive. You increase the price of carbon, you will increase the price of public transportation. We know about all the social eruptions that came out from important increases in the prices of fuel. So that's not the way, it cannot be the only way. And most importantly, according to the IMF estimates, the rate of carbon pricing, be it tax, be it market, that needs to be implemented to correct or to drive us all to the climate goals that have been agreed with the Paris Agreement is $100 per unit. It's socially impracticable. So the big push confronts, one of the works we are preparing, and let's see if it will be possible to publish, but one of the things we want to show, and I actually did some simulations of that in my doctoral thesis, is that if you implement a carbon pricing system alone, the social costs are so strong in order to achieve the climate goals. It doesn't make any sense, it would be politically impractical. But if you use carbon pricing, and I'm a strong believer of that, as an instrument to create fiscal space, as an instrument of financing, creating the space to do all the other policies that will be effective. So it's not effective in inducing behavioral change, but it can finance all the other, including social compensations of the effects that the transition can happen. Then we have a solid mix in the three-dimensional economic, social, and environmental mix. But I agree with you 100%. You went to the heart. The issue now becomes more of a political economy one. I am hopeful. I have not given up hope. I'm still young. I have to believe. And but more than that, I think that really, and Brazil in particular is in a very special position. The new federal administration has made the ecological, the green transition as one of the priority of the new administration. There has been some frustration that, in the sense that this proposal should be ready for discussion sooner, but they're still being built, and I understand that the capabilities of the states are being rebuilt, and we cannot do any policies if there are not state capabilities. So indeed, I think that now that the first semester of the new administration has completed, and we are hearing all these announcements at this moment right now, there is the Amazon Summit going on. I think that this is really the moment. I think that political momentum is scaling because of Brazil's leadership. And this is not a naive comment. It's very clear, and again, all of this from a personal perspective. The political gap in the international scenario of Brazil's role has been very evident in the latest years. Brazil will be chair president of the G20, Mercosul, the BRICS, the mission of the Ministerial of the Energy Ministers. A lot will happen under Brazil's leadership in the coming years, which give me hope that it might happen. And I am very aware that this is a very complicated debate. The interests conflict is very clear, even within the left. It's not defined. This debate about Petrobras, for instance, it's not defined. We have a legislative power that has been even more extreme rights than ever. So it's not going to be easy, but I think we have reasons to have hope and to keep providing the evidence and the tech and keep doing our jobs as the best that we can. That's how I see this. And Manuel, so again, I will respond your questions based on my personal perspectives. In my doctoral thesis, I analyzed a combination of low carbon technologies and their impacts in Brazil. And one of the technologies I looked at was gas. This is a tricky one because I think the starting point of this discussion, and I don't know how much all of you are familiar with the climate challenge ahead of us, but in order to achieve the Paris Agreement goal, what is the Paris Agreement? Is the current most important global climate commitment that was defined by its member countries. And the Paris Agreement is very elegant in the sense that the countries agree to the safe level of warming. So the countries agreed that the safe level of warming is 2 degrees Celsius, based on scientific evidence from the IPCC, with efforts to achieve 1.5. It might sound very little, 1.5 to 2, but the effects are tremendous, the difference. So the countries agreed. And I think that this was the major innovation that allowed for this agreement to be approved by all its members. Because it does not say, hey, you have to reduce by 50%, you by 40%. It says, hey, we agree with this goal, and then each country informs how much they can contribute, bearing in mind that we all as a global community need to get to that point. And in order to achieve 2 degrees Celsius warming, humanity needs to reach 0 net emissions. This is the scale of change that we're talking about. This is the only way. And the sooner we get there, this defines the degree of warming that we will achieve. And at some point, it needs to stop. So if we are talking about the 1.5% degree, we need to achieve 0 net emissions. This means reducing as much as we possibly can. And those things that we cannot avoid emitting, we then need to compensate. We need to capture that CO2 and store it in the ground or whatever, but not let it go into the atmosphere. So if we want to achieve 1.5, we need to be net zero by 2050. We will be alive then. I hope to see this happening. If we want to achieve net 2 degree warming, we need to achieve net zero by the end of the century. And the further we go into the future, the further we delay the net zero, the more warming we will observe. But at some point, there needs to stop, because the human existence on this planet is not compatible with an ever warmer planet. I want to emphasize this because sometimes we as economists keep looking at numbers and debates, but this is very serious. We need to go to net zero. So going back to your question, gas. Natural gas is a fossil fuel, but it's a cheap fuel, and it can be used many give you my personal view for now. I also see it as a transition fuel. We cannot use gas forever. It's a natural, it's a fossil fuel. It emits greenhouse gases. It emits less than gasoline, it emits less than diesel, it emits less than carbon. It does, but it emits, we need to go to net zero. So it can be used as a transition fuel. I think it should be used as a transition fuel. We have the infrastructure for it, which could later on be used for green hydrogen. Hydrogen is a gas. It could make use of the, it doesn't matter if it's natural fossil fuel, if it's hydrogen gas format. The infrastructure could be used for that. But I see that as a transition fuel. It's not possible to increase the scale and keep using fossil fuels forever, especially in the current context of energy crisis worldwide because of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Many countries are actually going for natural gas and other fossil fuels because of the war. Nuclear, I think that's an even more complicated one, and I'll give you my personal view again. I think that there is so much potential from renewables, from solar, from wind, onshore and offshore, from biomass, from geothermal, from green hydrogen. I think there's so much more sources that we have not fully explored, and these would be priorities for me. I would only go for nuclear if we exhaust all other possibilities, because it really is zero emitter, does not emit, but it's a potential hazard for human lives. So it's very rare, it does not happen regularly, but when a nuclear disaster occurs, the effects are tremendous and they are long lasting. So I would only go for this as a like B, C, or D. And your question about the space, the political space, you are very elegant in your question, but of course there is disputes. Of course there is dispute. There is no reason why the climate agenda would be different from any other international agenda. And even the negotiating teams sometimes are the same. The ones that go to World Trade Organization, that discuss bilateral trade agreement. Of course, it is a bargain. It is. And again, my personal view, I think that Latin American countries, and Brazil, especially Argentina as well, Mexico, Colombia, these are all countries that can become, that can benefit if they have their internal policies to back up strong positions in these agreements. But it will be a political dispute, no doubt, no shadow of doubt. I hope I answered.
Wait, we still have some time, so let's collectively have a group and then one.
Thank you very much, Camila, for this very interesting presentation. And my question is that when we get a good example in terms of the implementation of policies for the green transition, normally we get those countries, China and then European Union and then basically the Asian countries. And my question is if we do have good examples also in the global south within peripheral countries. You were talking about Brazil, so which may be a leader in this sense, but are there good examples within the global south in this reorientation of the development strategy?
Well, first, it's a big presentation, thanks for that. My name is João Marcos, I'm from Federal University, Fluminense Federal University, I don't know how to say in English, and it's I hope it's a simple question, but you, at the end of the replies you gave them, you talked a bit further about the storage of greenhouse that we need to do in order to, if we don't reach net zero greenhouse emissions, we have to capture greenhouse emissions to storage. And I'm glad to ask you, among the many projects that we listen about, it one very simple one simple. I mean, in terms of the reforestation, plants new forests. And I would like to know whether this is anything, I mean, I'm very curious of this kind of strategy. And I would like to know whether this is a bit studied in your research project, and whether a methodological one is whether it's, if you are already studying in this project of yours, if it's already included in the simulation that you just presented us.
Your question is that, have you considered in São Paulo, the Amazon, the region of Amazon as a specific area that has to be considered individually or in a particular way different from other parts? Because what can we suggest alternatively for the population that lives in activities that are not sustainable? Activities. The local population, I think this is a big problem. That is not only Brazil, I think that is all the area in Amazon as well.
Manuel, we'll have any other questions? Because then we can.
Yeah. No, one on lithium. Because you have like these three models, yeah, the Chilean one that is more at the national level, but more private sector. Bolivia that is more state-owned, but they are not producing. And Argentina is in something going like Chile, but at the level of the states, provinces. But there is no discussion of any coordination between these countries. So at this point, I am really pessimistic because we cannot even coordinate our provinces. So you have the Chinese and the US that directly negotiate with the governors, so the national level cannot. So thinking in a coordination at the level of the triangle of the three countries is even more difficult. Do you have any idea?
Okay, so very good questions again. So Bruno, about examples from the Global South, there are some interesting examples, not on the scale and the magnitude of the big push, but there are some interesting examples. So in Cambodia, for instance, there is a green Keynesian program named Tree Tsunami. The government has captured funding from international assistance, grants from developed countries, to give money to poor families, poor rural families, it's a rural country, to plant trees. So they're essentially giving income and expanding power by, through a major reforestation program. They plan to plant 1 billion trees in the country. This is one positive experience. Then we have other more sectoral experiences. Costa Rica, for instance, has a bioeconomy strategy. It has installed a factory to add value to their bioproducts. That is an interesting factory park or an industrial park. That it's an interesting example. Chile has also updated its climate targets as part of their recovery plan. So the fact that their climate targets have become more ambitious, they decided to cut more emissions than they had already planned, is part of their recovery transition strategy from the pandemic. So Chile is a country that has a lot of potential for solar panels, and this will then be used to supply the electric fleet that the country is planning on expanding. Santiago is a very contaminated city, and most of the contamination comes from urban transport. So electrification is an interesting solution for them, and the combination of electric fleets with renewable energy is an interesting combination we have been looking at. And I'll respond, Manuel, I will not respond, but I'll comment on your question, because electromobility is here. It is a fierce trend. It has been imposing itself. I don't see it's being reduced or in any way or form. And I'm saying this, again, speaking very freely, this is my personal view and not CEPAL. Latin America and the Caribbean is a very strong region in biofuels. And in the case of Brazil, this has been a topic of discussion, whether the technological paradigm will be electric or biofuels. And currently there is a debate of integrating both, but I will not go into that. But just to say that electric mobility is an irreversible trend. Part of the reason being that the headquarters of the automobile industries are based in countries that have zero internal combustion engine. So there will be no more combustion engines in the future in the headquarters, and this will translate to peripheral countries necessarily. So it's an irreversible trend. And I agree 100% with you that currently the way this trend is being perceived and implemented is creating another economically dominating relationship in which developing countries will provide the minerals and then buy the batteries and buy the cars and buy the buses or trains, any electrical vehicle we're talking about. So without changing the policy framework and the governance framework, we will repeat the unsustainable development style in the sense that we'll probably exhaust mineral reserves. We, Latin American and Caribbean countries, will probably explore this in an unsustainable way, both environmentally and socially. The contamination effects of some mining practices are very serious. It will probably revert all the income and profitability to the center. So it can be, again, another, some authors refer to it as green capitalism and green dominance. This can happen. And I think that what we try to convey in the message that we'll just say with the big push is the green transition needs to be led by the state, will not happen on its own. And in order for it to become a development agenda, we need to discuss the set of policies, governance, and everything. So this is what I can say about your question, and I agree fully with you. And João, on carbon capture and storage, this is a magic box from us modelers that do long-term scenario simulation. So we put there CCS, right? Carbon capture and storage, but this is not, the carbon capture and storage technologies are not fully developed yet. So we're counting that they will be ready by the end of the century, but they might not. And this creates a lot of difficulties because it is impossible to achieve zero emissions. That are some emissions that are unavoidable. For instance, in the iron industry, siderurgia, some types of iron cannot be produced without fossil coal, carvão fossil. Other types can. There are already iron and steel plants that work or that are powered by vegetable coal, charcoal, carvão vegetal. But this does not reach the temperature level that the fossil coal does. So there are some sectors that, this is one example that in which it might be inevitable, and we do not exist as modern societies without iron and steel. So there will be cases in which it is impossible, technologically impossible. So for these cases, there will need to be carbon capture and storage. And your question is very interesting because I see that there is a major opportunity that the developing countries could explore more in the discussion, which is reforestation. This is ancient technology. Actually, the modern scientists, biologists are going back to the traditional communities to learn from them because some methods are more carbon intensive, carbon sequestering intensive than the modern monoforests. So eucalyptus, pinus, they sequester much less than native forests. This could be a major form that developing countries could attract easy money because it's also very cheap from donors worldwide. And it's also one of the ideas that the agribusiness sector has their eyes on. One of the perspectives that some stakeholders in this sector have to support the forest code, which determines mandatory areas that need to have forest coverage, is an expectation that they will be able to monetize this because of the carbon that is stored there. So forests are a safe and known technology of sequestering carbon. The same way that deforestation emits so much carbon, all the carbon that is stored in the leaves, in the branches, in the roots, in the soil, when it's deforested, it goes into the atmosphere. When it's reforested, it's captured and it stays there. Other more modern technologies, you can have a look later on, it look very modernistic, like major giant ventiladores, fans that capture CO2 and then inject it into old petrol holes, buracos, da extração de petróleo. But these are all, we're not sure if the carbon will really stay there and how much can we store in this way and how are we going to transport the CO2. Reforestation is simple, it's elegant, and it could be an important source of revenue for developing countries. Professor Medeiros, again, very relevant country, and a question especially now that we are seeing the Amazon Summit. The Amazon is special in so many ways. We cannot not have a special strategy or a targeted strategy for the Amazon. There is an interesting proposal. So I don't want to take too much more of the time, but let's go to basic economics, which you taught me so well. There are 30 million people in the Amazon. There are a lot of people in the Amazon. Some people forget that. I once heard the idea of a green embrace. Let's close the Amazon. No, that's not about closing the Amazon. And it's a very poor area. A significant share of their population live in poverty. So what do we want? We want the standing trees, right? Árvores em pé. We don't want to chop down and deforest, so we must extract the highest value added possible in order for there to be more income without deforestation. So this means a lot of RD&D, a lot of modern technologies combined with traditional knowledge. There is a very interesting proposal by Professor Carlos Nobre, do INPE, named Amazon 4.0, which is exactly about that. It's about, he makes a comparison about Industry 4.0 and how this could be adapted, how the characteristics of Industry 4.0 would be compatible with an Amazon 4.0 in the sense of being more decentralized units, the targeted production, not necessarily massive scale industrial production, but more targeted, it could be an added value, community based. It's a very interesting proposal. So there are some ideas in that sense, and more than ideas. NABRE is also conducting the first pilots of these projects in the Amazon. It's very interesting. Some R&D laboratories in the middle of the forest. It's very interesting, but you're completely right again. The Amazon does need a specific strategy given their specificities.
Thank you very much, Camila. So a big thank you to Camila again for your reaction.